Imagine being a warrior's wife, living peacefully in your home, when suddenly enemy soldiers break down your door. Your husband has fallen in battle, and now you're completely at their mercy. What happens next would change your life forever, and not in any way you could imagine. The Ottoman Empire had a system for dealing with the wives of defeated enemies that was so brutal, so systematic, that many historians argue it was worse than simply being killed. Today we're going to talk about one of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history. A practice that lasted for centuries and affected thousands of women across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Get ready, because what you're about to hear will shock you. Let me start by painting you a picture of what life was like during the height of the Ottoman Empire. We're talking about the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries when the Ottomans were expanding their territory at lightning speed. They were conquering Christian kingdoms, Muslim emirates, and everything in between. When Ottoman armies rolled into a new territory, they weren't just looking to collect taxes and move on. They had a very specific strategy for making sure conquered people stayed conquered. And at the heart of this strategy was something called the devshirme system. Now, you've probably heard about how the Ottomans took Christian boys from their families to train as elite soldiers called janissaries. But what most people don't know is that they had an equally devastating system for dealing with the women left behind. When a city or region fell to Ottoman forces, the fate of the defeated wasn't left to chance. The Ottomans had detailed procedures for categorizing every single person they conquered. Men of fighting age who had resisted, usually executed or sold into slavery. Young boys between 8 and 18, taken for the devshirme system. But the wives of defeated warriors faced something entirely different. The Ottoman system divided these women into several categories. First were the wives of noble warriors and military leaders. These women were considered the most valuable prizes of war. They were typically taken directly into the households of Ottoman officials or wealthy merchants. But here's where it gets really dark. These weren't just becoming servants or even regular slaves. They were being systematically broken down and rebuilt as completely different people. The process started the moment they were captured. Their names were taken away and replaced with Turkish names. Their clothes were burned and replaced with Ottoman dress. Any jewelry, family heirlooms, or personal items were confiscated. If they had children, those children were separated from them immediately. Boys went into the devshirme system, while girls were sent to different households entirely. The psychological impact of this separation was intentional. The Ottomans understood that breaking the bond between mother and child was one of the most effective ways to break a person's spirit. But the name changes weren't just administrative convenience. Names carry identity, family history, cultural connection. When a woman named Maria became Ice, or when Catherine became Fatma, it wasn't just a new label. It was the first step in erasing who they had been. The second phase involved forced conversion to Islam. Now, the Ottoman Empire was actually relatively tolerant of other religions compared to many empires of that time. But for the wives of defeated warriors, conversion wasn't optional. They had to learn Islamic prayers, customs, and laws. They had to adopt Islamic dietary restrictions and dress codes. Many of these women had been deeply religious Christians, and being forced to abandon their faith was like losing another piece of their soul. The third phase was cultural assimilation. They had to learn Turkish or Arabic, depending on where they ended up. They had to learn Ottoman customs, social hierarchies, and ways of behavior. Women who had once been ladies of castles or wives of knights found themselves learning to serve tea in the Ottoman style. They had to memorize complex rules about how to interact with men, how to behave in front of their new Ottoman families, how to dress, how to speak. The physical conditions varied depending on who owned them. Wives of defeated nobles who ended up in wealthy Ottoman households might live in relative comfort. But comfort came at the price of complete submission. They lived in a world where their every move was watched and controlled. Many were assigned to work in the women's quarters of Ottoman houses, where they rarely saw sunlight or had contact with the outside world. Others ended up in the households of middle-class Ottoman families, where they worked as domestic servants. The lucky ones might eventually be treated almost like family members, but they could never forget their status. They were property, not people. Some ended up in the harems of wealthy Ottomans. Now, Western movies and books have really romanticized the idea of harems. But the reality was very different. These were essentially prisons where women competed for the attention of their owner. The psychological warfare between women trapped in these situations was brutal. Former queens and noble ladies found themselves fighting over scraps of attention from men who owned them. But here's what makes this system particularly cruel. The Ottomans were smart enough to know that completely crushing these women would make them useless. So they created a twisted kind of hope. Women who adapted well to their new lives could eventually earn small privileges. Maybe they could oversee other servants. Maybe they could influence household decisions. In rare cases, they might even become the favored wife or concubine of their owner. This carrot-and-stick approach was psychologically devastating because it made the women complicit in their own oppression. To survive, they had to not just accept their new reality but actively participate in it. They had to smile and pretend to be happy with their new Ottoman families. They had to speak fondly of their new religion and culture. Some even had to help train other captured women in Ottoman ways. The most heartbreaking part? Many of these women eventually had children with their Ottoman captors. These children would be raised as full Ottomans, often never knowing their mother's true background. Imagine being forced to raise your own child to believe in the system that had destroyed your previous life. The children would speak Turkish, follow Islamic customs, and think of themselves as Ottoman citizens. Meanwhile, their mothers carried the secret pain of their lost identity, their murdered husbands, their abandoned homeland. Some women found ways to preserve tiny pieces of their former lives. They might teach their children a lullaby from their homeland, disguised as just a pretty song. They might prepare a dish from their old country, claiming it was just something they had learned. But these small acts of resistance were dangerous. If discovered, they could face severe punishment or separation from their children. The psychological toll was enormous. Many women developed what we would today recognize as severe depression and trauma. But in Ottoman society, mental health wasn't understood the way we understand it now. Women who couldn't adapt were often seen as defective or ungrateful. The social isolation was perhaps the worst part. These women were cut off from everyone who had known them in their previous life. They couldn't share their real memories, their real feelings, their real identity with anyone. They lived surrounded by people but completely alone with their secrets. Some tried to escape, but the Ottoman Empire was vast, and they often had no idea where they were in relation to their homeland. Even if they made it back, they would return to find their homes destroyed, their communities scattered, their former lives completely gone. And here's a cruel irony, because they had been forced to convert to Islam and had lived as Ottoman women, their own former communities might not accept them back. They would be seen as tainted or traitorous. The Ottoman system was designed to make return impossible, even if escape was successful. The empire kept detailed records of these women. Ottoman administrative documents show thousands upon thousands of names, ages, and origins of captured wives. They tracked who was sent where, who was still alive, who had children, who had died. The bureaucratic efficiency of it all makes it even more chilling. This wasn't random violence or chaos of war. This was a calculated, systematic program designed to break the spirit of conquered peoples by destroying their families. Some historians argue that this system was actually more effective than mass killings. Dead martyrs can inspire resistance movements. But broken families? Scattered children? Women forced to raise the next generation as loyal Ottomans? That destroys the cultural continuity needed for long-term resistance. The practice continued for centuries because it worked. Regions that were conquered using these methods stayed conquered. The psychological warfare was so effective that entire cultures simply disappeared, absorbed into the Ottoman system. What makes this even more tragic is that many of these women were incredibly strong, intelligent, and capable people. They had been partners to warriors, mothers to future leaders, pillars of their communities. The Ottoman system took all of that strength and intelligence and twisted it to serve the empire that had destroyed their lives. By the time the Ottoman Empire began to decline in the 18th and 19th centuries, this practice had affected hundreds of thousands of women across 3 continents. Entire bloodlines had been redirected, entire cultures had been diluted or erased. The ripple effects lasted for generations. The story of what the Ottomans did to the wives of defeated warriors is a reminder that sometimes survival can be its own form of suffering. These women lived, but they lived as shadows of their former selves. They had children and even found moments of happiness, but always carrying the weight of their stolen identities. Their strength in adapting to impossible circumstances is admirable, but we should never forget the cost of that adaptation. The Ottoman Empire fell almost a century ago, but the lessons from this dark chapter of history remain relevant today. Whenever we see systematic attempts to break down family structures or erase cultural identities, we should remember these forgotten women. What do you think about this system? Can you imagine having to completely rebuild your identity to survive? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this video opened your eyes to a part of history you didn't know about, please give it a like and share it with others. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of history. Because the past has lessons for all of us, even when those lessons are hard to hear.